stepped off the transport ship and onto the metal floor of Research Station 442B. His four legs clicked against the surface as he moved forward. The sound echoed through the empty docking bay. His compound eyes scanned the area looking for threats. This was his job. This was what all did when they entered a new place. The station smelled wrong. It did not smell like home. It did not smell like the other Confederation worlds he had visited. This place smelled of strange creatures and unknown dangers. His antennae twitched as they picked up scent traces he could not identify. A door opened across the docking bay. His body tensed. His natural armor plates shifted slightly, ready to protect him. Three creatures walked through the door. They moved on only two legs, which seemed very unsafe. They had no visible armor, no claws, no spikes. They looked soft and weak. "You must be our military advisor," said the creature in front. It was smaller than the other two, but it moved with confidence. "I'm Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, Terran Marines." Had studied the files about humans before coming here. He knew they were new members of the Galactic Confederation. He knew they came from a world called Earth. He knew they were classified as a peaceful trading species, but seeing them in person was different from reading files. "I am Strategic Analyst of the Defense Corps," he replied. His translator device changed his clicking sounds into words the humans could understand. "I have come to help prepare defenses for this station." The human called Santos showed her teeth. Sphere glands released a small amount of warning chemicals. Showing teeth was a threat display in most species, but his files said humans did this when they were happy. It was very confusing. "Welcome to our little corner of nowhere," Santos said. "Let me show you around and introduce you to the team." As they walked through the station, observed the humans carefully. There were 12 of them total. They all wore the same dark clothing with many pockets. They carried weapons that seemed too small to be effective. Most strange of all, they seemed relaxed. How could they be relaxed on a frontier station where danger could come at any moment? "Tell me about your defense protocols," said as they entered the main meeting room. Santos sat down at a table. The other humans sat around her. None of them checked the room for hiding places or escape routes first. This behavior made no sense to. "We've got standard perimeter sensors," Santos explained. "Energy shields around the station, 12 Marines with combat experience, basic military supplies." She paused and looked at him. "What does your species recommend for frontier defense?" Activated his portable data display. Numbers and charts appeared in the air between them. "Combat doctrine is based on mathematical analysis of threat levels," he began. "When our fear response reaches 67% of maximum, we implement tactical withdrawal. This strategy has resulted in a 94.3% survival rate across 847 recorded conflicts." The humans looked at each other. One of them, a young male, raised his hand like a student. "Yes," said. "What happens if you can't withdraw?" the young human asked. "That situation should never occur," replied. "Proper planning prevents such circumstances. We only fight when victory is mathematically certain." Santos leaned forward in her chair. "But what if something important is at stake? What if people are counting on you to hold the line?" "Lines are temporary constructs," explained. "Territory can be retaken, resources can be replaced, lives cannot be restored once lost." "What about honor?" asked another human. His antennae twitched in confusion. "Honor is not a tactical consideration." The humans were quiet for a moment, then Santos spoke again. "We might see things differently. Humans have a saying, 'Some things are worth dying for.'" "That is illogical," said. "Dead soldiers protect nothing." Before anyone could respond, alarms began ringing throughout the station. Red lights flashed on the walls. A mechanical voice spoke from hidden speakers. "Alert! Long-range sensors have detected multiple unknown vessels approaching the system. Estimated arrival time, 72 hours. Everyone stood up quickly. Sphere glands activated automatically. Unknown vessels usually meant trouble. His body began preparing for tactical withdrawal. "Doctor, what do the sensor readings show?" Santos called out. A human with graying hair hurried into the room carrying a data pad. 15 ships, possibly more. They're using some kind of stealth technology. Energy signatures match the reports we've been getting about Void Hunter activity in nearby systems. Sphere response jumped to 32% immediately. The Void Hunters were not just dangerous. They were catastrophic. His species had encountered them twice before. Both times, entire fleets had been forced to withdraw. "Void Hunters," he said, his voice carrying the scent of alarm pheromones. "We must evacuate immediately. This station cannot be defended against them." Santos looked at her data pad. "Evacuation ships won't arrive for a week. We're on our own." "Then we must hide," said. "We can shut down all power and wait for them to pass." "They're not passing," Doctor said grimly. "Their trajectory shows they're coming straight for us. Something on this station has their attention." Santos was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked around at her team. "Opinions." "We could try to make a run for it in our transport ships," suggested one Marine. "Void Hunters are faster than anything we have," another replied. "What about fighting?" asked the young human who had spoken earlier. Sphere level increased to 41%. "Fighting Void Hunters is suicide. They adapt to our weapons. They turn our own technology against us. They cannot be defeated by conventional means." "Maybe," Santos said, "but running isn't always the answer." She stood up and walked to the window that looked out into space. The stars looked peaceful, but knew that somewhere in that darkness, death was coming toward them. "I've never fought Void Hunters before," Santos admitted, "but I've fought things that seemed impossible to beat. Sometimes you find a way, sometimes you make a way." Studied the humans around him. His fear response was now at 53% and climbing. Soon it would reach the level where his body would force him to seek escape routes. But the humans showed no signs of fear at all. How was that possible? "You do not understand," he said. "Fear is a survival tool. When danger exceeds acceptable parameters, intelligent species retreat to fight another day." Santos turned away from the window and looked at him. "Maybe that's where we're different. Maybe humans are just too stupid to know when we should be scared." She smiled again, showing her teeth, but this time thought there might be more to that expression than happiness. This time it looked almost dangerous. The next morning, watched the humans prepare for battle training. They moved around the station with purpose, but not with the careful precision he expected from soldiers facing certain death. Instead, they seemed almost excited. "Today we run combat simulations," Santos announced to her team. "We need to know how well we work together with our advisor." Had agreed to participate in the training, though every instinct told him it was pointless. In 68 hours, the Void Hunters would arrive. No amount of practice would change the mathematical certainty of defeat. The training room was large and empty. Computer systems could create fake enemies using light and force fields. It was safe training, but it felt real enough to trigger proper fear responses. "Computer, load Scenario 7 Alpha," Santos called out. Suddenly, the room filled with the shapes of Void Hunter creatures. They looked like walking crystals, but crystals that moved with deadly purpose. Their surfaces reflected light in ways that hurt to look at. Sphere response immediately jumped to 45%. "Spread out and engage," Santos ordered. Expected the humans to take careful positions. He expected them to establish safe zones and retreat routes. Instead, they charged forward into danger. The simulation lasted 23 minutes. By calculations, the humans should have retreated after 4 minutes when their losses reached unacceptable levels. Instead, they fought until every simulated enemy was destroyed. "Good work," Santos said when the simulation ended. But we lost too many people. Let's try it again. Again? Asked. His fear levels were still high from the first simulation. We keep practicing until we get better, explained Corporal Williams, the young human from yesterday. That's how learning works. They ran the simulation 6 more times. Each time, fear response triggered earlier and stronger. Each time the humans seemed to get more determined, not more afraid. During the 4th simulation, watched Private Martinez charge directly at a group of simulated void hunters. The young human had already been killed twice in previous runs. Any rational creature would have developed a healthy fear by now. Why does he keep doing that? Asked Doctor, who was observing the training. Doing what? Running toward danger. His fear response should prevent such behavior. Doctor smiled. Who says he's not afraid? His antennae twitched in confusion. I detect no fear pheromones. His body language shows no stress indicators. Humans don't show fear the way your species does, Doctor explained. We've learned to function normally even when we're terrified. This made no sense to. Fear exists to prevent death. If you ignore it, you die. Sometimes, Doctor agreed, but sometimes fear lies to you. Sometimes the safe choice is actually the most dangerous one. After training ended, found himself in the station's common area with several humans. They were eating their evening meal and talking about things that had nothing to do with the approaching death fleet. Tell me about human military history, said suddenly. Santos looked up from her food. Any particular part? Tell me about times when humans faced impossible odds. The humans exchanged glances. Then Santos began speaking. There was a place called Thermopylae, she said. 300 Spartan warriors held off an army of thousands. They all died, but they bought time for their people to prepare. That sounds like a military disaster, observed. It was also a victory, Williams added. Sometimes you win by choosing what you're willing to lose for. Santos nodded. Or take the Alamo, small group of defenders against a huge army. They could have surrendered, but they fought to the end. Why? Asked. Because some things matter more than staying alive, Martinez said quietly. His compound eyes studied each human face. He was beginning to detect something he had missed before. There were subtle chemical traces in the air. Fear pheromones, but so faint he had almost missed them. You are afraid, he said suddenly. Of course we're afraid, Santos replied. We're not stupid. But you continue to function. You continue to plan for battle. Being afraid doesn't mean giving up, Doctor explained. Fear tells you that something is dangerous. It doesn't tell you to run away. What you do with that information is up to you. That night could not enter proper rest state. His mind kept processing what he had observed. The humans were afraid. He could detect it now that he knew what to look for, but their fear was different from fear. When became afraid, their bodies prepared for escape. Heart rate increased to support running. Muscles tensed for quick movement. Chemical signals encouraged retreat behavior. Human fear seemed to work differently. Their bodies also prepared for action, but not necessarily for escape. Their muscles tensed for fighting as much as for running. Their hearts beat faster to support either combat or retreat. Most puzzling of all, their fear seemed to make them more focused, not less. During the simulations, the humans had become more precise under pressure, not more scattered. The next morning brought worse news. Long-range sensors show the Void Hunter fleet has increased speed, Doctor reported. They'll arrive in 36 hours, not 72. Fear response spiked to 61%, 6% below the threshold that would force him to seek immediate evacuation. Change of plans, Santos announced. We accelerate all preparations, full combat readiness in 12 hours. This is illogical, said. His voice carried strong alarm pheromones now. We should use the remaining time to reach minimum safe distance. In what ships? Santos asked. Our transports are slower than Void Hunter vessels. They'd catch us before we cleared the system. Then we should hide. They're coming straight for us. Hiding won't work. Then we should surrender. Santos looked at him with that strange tooth-showing expression again. Void Hunters don't take prisoners. They consume everything they find. Fell silent. His fear level was now at 64% and climbing. Soon his body would override his conscious mind and force him to seek escape, even if no escape existed. But the humans continued working. They checked weapons. They reviewed battle plans. They prepared for a fight they could not win. "I do not understand your species," said the doctor. "What don't you understand? You know you will die. You know the battle cannot be won, yet you do not despair." Doctor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe that's because we see something different when we look at impossible odds." "What do you see?" "A chance to surprise everyone, including ourselves." Outside the station's windows, the stars looked the same as always. But somewhere in that darkness, death was coming faster than expected. And for reasons could not understand, the humans seemed almost eager to meet it. The Void Hunters arrived 6 hours early. Alarms screamed through the station as 15 crystalline ships dropped out of hyperspace. They moved like hungry predators, their surfaces reflecting the light of the system's star in patterns that seemed to shift and change. Sphere response immediately hit 73%, past the threshold. His body demanded retreat. His legs wanted to run. His chemical glands flooded his system with escape hormones. But there was nowhere to go. "Battle stations," Santos shouted over the alarm noise. "This is not a drill." The humans moved with sudden speed and precision. They grabbed weapons and took positions throughout the station, watched them in amazement. He could smell their fear now. It was strong in the air, stronger than his own. But instead of running, they were moving toward danger. "Station shields at maximum," reported Williams from the control center. "Weapons systems online." Through the observation windows, watched the Void Hunter ships approach. They moved in patterns that hurt to follow with his compound eyes. Sometimes they seemed solid. Sometimes they appeared to be made of light and shadow. The first attack came without warning. Beams of crystalline energy struck the station's shields. The lights flickered. The floor shook. Warning sirens added their voices to the chaos. "Shields down to 80%, Williams called out. "Return fire," Santos ordered. The station's defensive guns opened up. Energy blasts and missiles shot out toward the attacking ships. Some found their targets. Explosions bloomed against the crystal hulls. But the Void Hunter ships did not stop. They did not slow down. Instead, they seemed to absorb the weapon's fire and grow brighter. "They're adapting," Doctor said grimly. "They're learning from our attacks." Had read about this. Void Hunters could analyze any weapon used against them and develop defenses. Fight them long enough, and they became immune to everything you had. "Shields down to 60%, Williams reported. "Switch to kinetic weapons," Santos ordered. "Projectile guns only." The station's defensive fire changed. Instead of energy beams, solid bullets and explosive shells shot toward the enemy. This time, the impacts seemed to cause real damage. But there were 15 Void Hunter ships. The station had weapons designed to fight off pirates and raiders, not a full war fleet. "Shields down to 40%. Sphere was now at 81%, higher than he had ever experienced while remaining conscious. His body was screaming at him to find an escape pod, a transport ship, anything that could get him away from this place. He looked around at the humans. Their fear scent was overwhelming now. It filled the air like a fog. They should be paralyzed with terror. They should be cowering in corners. Instead, they were working harder. Private Martinez had taken apart a broken weapon and was using its pieces to repair 2 others. Corporal Williams was manually targeting the station's guns because the computer systems were failing. Even Doctor, who was not a soldier, was carrying ammunition to the gun positions. "I don't understand," said DeSantos as she coordinated the defense. "Your fear levels are off the scale. How are you still functioning?" Santos wiped sweat from her face. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. "Fear keeps you sharp," she said. "Makes you think faster, makes you stronger." "Fear is a warning to retreat," replied. "Sometimes," Santos agreed. "But sometimes fear is just your body getting ready for the fight of your life." A Void Hunter ship broke through the defensive fire and slammed into the station's outer hull. The impact threw everyone to the floor. Emergency lights turned the corridors red. "Hull breach in sections 7 through 12, Williams reported. "Emergency force fields in place, but they won't hold long." Santos grabbed a rifle and headed toward the breach. "Martinez, Williams with me. Everyone else, keep those guns firing." "You're going toward the breach?" asked in disbelief. "They're trying to board us," Santos explained. "Can't let them get inside." Found himself following the humans toward the damaged section of the station. This went against every survival instinct he possessed. His fear level was now at 87%. He should be unconscious from terror. Instead, something was driving him forward. They reached the breach just as the first Void Hunters broke through the emergency force field. The creatures were even more terrifying in person than in the training simulations. They moved like liquid crystal, flowing and reshaping themselves as they advanced. The humans opened fire immediately. The first shot seemed to hurt the Void Hunters. Crystal fragments flew off their bodies, but then the creatures began to change. Their surfaces shifted and adapted. The bullets began to bounce off harmlessly. "They're learning," Martinez shouted. "Then we learn faster," Santos replied. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed it at the nearest Void Hunter. The chemical foam seemed to confuse the creature's adaptive systems. It stumbled and fell. "Use anything except guns," Santos ordered. "Don't let them adapt to the same thing twice." What followed was the strangest battle had ever witnessed. The humans fought with tools, chemicals, pieces of broken equipment, even their bare hands. Every time the Void Hunters adapted to one attack, the humans switched to something completely different. Williams used electrical cables like whips. Martinez threw acid from the cleaning supplies. Doctor, who had somehow appeared in the battle, was using a medical laser to blind the creatures. And through it all, could smell their overwhelming fear. They were more terrified than any living beings he had ever encountered. But their terror seemed to make them more creative, more desperate, more dangerous. "Shields down to 10%, came the report from the control center. "Station weapons offline," came another report. The battle was almost over. The Void Hunters would break through soon. The station would fall. But the humans did not stop fighting. Santos, bleeding from cuts on her face and arms, stood over the body of a fallen Void Hunter and shouted at the rest of her team. "We're not dead yet. Keep moving. Keep fighting." Stared at her in wonder and terror. Her fear scent was so strong it made his own glands ache. She was shaking from exhaustion and blood loss. By all logic, she should collapse. Instead, she looked more dangerous than ever. "Fall back to the reactor chamber," she ordered. "If we're going down, we make them pay for every step." As they retreated deeper into the station, realized something that shocked him to his core. The humans were not fighting despite their fear. They were fighting because of it. Their terror was not paralyzing them. It was fueling them, making them faster, stronger, more creative than they had any right to be. And for the first time in his life, began to understand what the humans meant when they talked about courage. The reactor chamber was the last safe place on the station. Thick walls surrounded the power core that kept the lights on and the life support running. It was also the place where they would all die. Only 7 defenders remained alive. Santos, Martinez, Williams, Doctor, and 3 other Marines whose names had never learned. And himself, though he still could not understand why he had followed them here instead of finding a place to hide. Outside the chamber, the Void Hunters were cutting through the doors. The sound of crystal claws on metal echoed through the room like screams. Sphere response had broken his measurement scale. It was higher than he had ever thought possible. His body should have shut down from terror overload, but something was keeping him conscious. Something was making him stay with these impossible humans. "How long until they break through?" Santos asked. Her voice was steady but could see her hands shaking. 5 minutes, maybe less, Williams replied. He was bleeding from a head wound, but he kept checking his weapon. "Then we have 5 minutes to figure out how to kill them all," Santos said. Doctor laughed. It was a sound that carried both humor and hysteria. "Kill them with what? We're down to 3 working guns and a handful of ammunition." Studied the humans around him. Their fear scent was so thick in the air that he could barely breathe. Martinez was quietly crying while he loaded his last magazine. Williams kept muttering prayers under his breath. Even Santos, their unshakable leader, had tears running down her face. They were all completely, utterly terrified. And they were still planning to fight. "I don't understand your species," said suddenly. Santos looked at him. "What?" "You're more afraid than any creatures I've ever encountered. Your fear response is stronger than us, but you don't retreat, you don't collapse. How is this possible?" Doctor wiped blood from his face and smiled grimly. "Want to know a secret? Humans are the most frightened species in the galaxy." "That makes no sense." "Think about it," Doctor continued. "We're soft. We have no natural weapons, no armor, no claws or fangs. We're slow compared to most predators, weak compared to most herbivores. We should be prey animals." The cutting sounds at the door were getting louder. "But we're not prey," Santos added. "Know why?" Waited for her to continue. "Because we learned to be afraid of the right things at the right time. And we learned that being afraid doesn't mean giving up." "Fear is a survival tool," protested, repeating what he had been taught since birth. "Yes," Doctor agreed, "but survival doesn't always mean running away. Sometimes survival means standing your ground and fighting back." The door began to buckle inward. Crystal claws appeared through the growing gaps. "Sometimes," Santos said, raising her weapon, "survival means making the other guy more afraid than you are." Williams suddenly looked up from his weapon. "The reactor." "What about it?" Santos asked. "We could overload it, create an electromagnetic pulse, might disrupt their crystalline structure." Doctor stared at him. "That would destroy the station and us." "We're dead anyway," Martinez pointed out. His voice was quiet but steady. "At least this way we take them with us." Sphere reached levels he hadn't known were possible. But through that overwhelming terror, he finally understood what he was witnessing. The humans weren't just afraid. They were using their fear. They were turning their terror into weapon. "Do it," Santos ordered. Williams and Doctor began working on the reactor controls. Watched them with a mixture of awe and horror. They were preparing to die, and they were doing it calmly and efficiently. The door exploded inward. Void Hunters poured through the opening like a tide of living crystal. Their surfaces reflected the reactor's glow in hypnotic patterns. The final battle lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes of desperate, terrified humans fighting with everything they had. 3 minutes of creatures that should have been paralyzed by fear, instead becoming more dangerous than anyone had thought possible. Santos emptied her rifle into the lead Void Hunter, then used the empty weapon as a club. Martinez threw himself at another creature, wrapping his arms around it and pulling the pins from his grenades. Williams kept working on the reactor controls even as crystal claws raked across his back. And through it all, their fear filled the air like a visible thing. It was so strong that even the Void Hunters seemed confused by it. These creatures fed on terror, but this was terror that fought back. Doctor, dying from wounds that would have killed most creatures instantly, managed to complete the reactor overload sequence. As crystal claws pierced his chest, he looked at and smiled. "Fear isn't the enemy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the battle noise. "Giving up is." The reactor's warning lights began flashing. An automated voice announced, "Critical overload in 30 seconds. All personnel evacuate immediately." But there was nowhere to evacuate to. Santos, the last human still standing, looked around at her fallen team. Her fear scent was stronger than ever, but her eyes were filled with something had never seen before. It wasn't courage exactly. It was something bigger. It was the absolute refusal to surrender. "We're scared," she said to the advancing Void Hunters, her voice carrying across the chamber. "We're terrified, and we're not going anywhere." She raised her sidearm and fired at the nearest creature. The shot barely scratched its crystal surface. "You want to know what fear really is?" she shouted, tears streaming down her face as she kept firing. "Fear is what you feel when you corner something that's already decided to die fighting." The reactor reached critical mass. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the electromagnetic pulse erupted outward, washing over the station in a wave of pure energy. The Void Hunters' crystalline forms began to resonate and shatter. Their ships, caught in the pulse, went dark and dead. Felt the energy wash over him. His own body, not being crystalline, survived the pulse. As consciousness faded, his last thought was about what he had learned. Humans were not fearless. They were the most fearful creatures in the galaxy. And that was exactly what made them the most dangerous. Woke up to the sound of rescue ships docking with what remained of Research Station 442B. The electromagnetic pulse had saved them, but it had also destroyed most of the station's systems. Emergency power kept the life support running, but barely. He lay in the reactor chamber's shielded core, surrounded by the bodies of dead Void Hunters and dead humans. The crystal creatures had shattered when the pulse hit them. The humans had died from their wounds, but they had died victorious. Almost all of them. "Hey there, bug friend." Turned his head and saw Santos leaning against the reactor housing. She was badly wounded with bandages covering half her face, but she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was alive. "You survived," he said, his voice weak. "Barely," she coughed, and blood speckled her lips. "Williams and Martinez made it too, but they're in bad shape. Everyone else." She gestured at the bodies around them. "The Void Hunters. All dead. The pulse fried their ships and shattered their forms. Turns out crystalline beings don't handle electromagnetic overloads very well." Rescue workers in environmental suits entered the chamber. They began checking for survivors and collecting the dead. Watched them work with new eyes. Some of them were human. Others were different species from across the Confederation. But they all moved with the same careful respect for the fallen. "We need to get you to medical," one of the rescuers told Santos. "In a minute," she replied. Then she looked at, "I need to ask you something first." "What?" "When you file your report with the Confederation, what are you going to tell them about what happened here?" Was quiet for a long moment. What could he tell them? How could he explain what he had witnessed? "I will tell them the truth," he said finally. "Which is?" "That humans are not the species I thought they were." 3 weeks later, stood before the High Council. His report had caused a stir throughout the Confederation. Military leaders wanted to understand how 12 humans and one had defeated a Void Hunter fleet. Explain again how the humans continued to function with fear levels exceeding 90%, demanded Council leader. "They use fear differently than we do," replied. "For fear is a signal to retreat. For humans, fear is fuel for combat." "That makes no logical sense." Logic is not the correct framework for understanding human behavior, said. This statement caused murmurs of shock throughout the council chamber. Society was built on logic. Then what is the correct framework? Thought about Santos standing over her fallen comrades, tears streaming down her face as she fired her last shots at the Void Hunters. He thought about Doctor dying while completing the reactor overload, smiling as crystal claws pierced his chest. Humans have a word, he said slowly, courage, but their definition is not what we thought. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is action in spite of fear. But why would evolution produce such behavior? Another council member asked. Fear exists to preserve life. Human fear does preserve life, explained, but not always by retreat, sometimes by fighting so fiercely that the threat is eliminated entirely. He activated his data display and showed recordings from the battle. Observe their biometric readings during combat. Heart rate elevated to support sustained physical activity. Adrenaline levels maximized for enhanced strength and speed. Sensory awareness heightened beyond normal parameters. Fear was not disabling them. Fear was optimizing them for combat. The council watched the recordings in silence. They saw humans performing impossible feats while their terror readings went off the scale. Most remarkable, one member finally said. They weaponized their own fear response. More than that, replied. They turned fear from a weakness into a strength. When a human is afraid and fighting for something they care about, they become more dangerous than logic says should be possible. What do you recommend for future human relations? Had been thinking about this for weeks. I recommend that we study human military doctrine. There is much we can learn from species that has learned to fight while afraid. And personally, I have requested transfer to the Human Defense Corps. I want to understand more about how fear can be transformed into strength. The council was quiet for a long time. Then council leader spoke. Your request is approved, but first, help us understand one thing. How has this experience changed your own relationship with fear? Considered the question carefully. Since returning from the station, his fear responses had been different. He still felt afraid when facing danger, but now he understood that fear could be a beginning rather than an ending. I learned that there are two kinds of species in the universe, he said, those that run from their fears and humans. 6 months later, stood on the bridge of the human destroyer ship Indomitable. He wore a modified version of human military gear and carried weapons designed for his physiology. He was the first to serve in a human combat unit. Incoming transmission from Confederation Command, reported the communications officer. Multiple Void Hunter fleets detected in the Rigel system. They're requesting immediate assistance. Captain, a human who reminded of Santos, smiled grimly. Set course for Rigel. Maximum speed. Sir, said the navigation officer, enemy numbers are 30-1 against us. Excellent, replied. Fair odds at last. Felt his fear response activate as the ship jumped to hyperspace. But now he understood that this fear was not a weakness to overcome. It was a tool to be used, a source of strength waiting to be unlocked. Around him, the human crew prepared for another impossible battle. He could smell their fear in the air, sharp and strong, but he could also sense their determination. They were afraid, they were terrified, and they were going to win. As the ship raced toward danger, thought about the day he had battled beside humans and learned what fear really was. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. He had learned that sometimes the scariest thing you could do was stand your ground. And he had learned that humans, the most frightened species in the galaxy, were also the bravest. The stars streaked past as they flew toward another impossible fight, and for the first time in his life was eager to be afraid.